Control-Alt-Delete. Did you know that that simple and familiar keystroke was never meant for our fingers? In fact, it was first invented in 1980 by an IBM engineer, meant for internal use only. Next thing you know, 10, 15 years later, we all have PCs. Those PCs don't always work, and Control-Alt-Delete goes wide. And plus, we as humans love a good reset button. We need a good reset button because so many things in life you know to be true, and then it becomes a fact. And most of those things, they stand as facts the rest of your life. Only some of them don't. Some of those you recognize that you're wrong and you need a reset button. Control-Alt-Delete. Imagine walking the streets, the cobblestone streets of Florence, Italy in the 1600s, and Galileo looks over to you and says, hey, or you know how we think that the sun revolves around the earth? Well, what if it's actually the exact opposite? Control-Alt-Delete. We need these moments in our lives. And if you would be so kind, how about a quick group exercise? Because I'm going to envision that this big, beautiful auditorium is actually a big, beautiful keyboard. And Control key is over here, Alt, we got Delete over here. We're gonna take a collective breath. And in this process, when you exhale, will you envision yourself pressing those three keys or whatever reset button you like, because what I'm about to speak about, I believe, requires a reset on all of our parts. So deep inhale. Friends, we are in pain. Existential pain, always, but real, actual physical pain as well. And we need to kill this pain. Humans and adults in the modern world, especially men, are not known for their pain tolerance. But the painkillers are killing us in record numbers, and the opioid crisis is very, very real. There's a safer alternative painkiller out there, and we're not talking about it. And so that's what I'm here to talk about. Let's talk about it. Let's talk about weed. Let's talk about weed, yeah. You know, it's funny, it's still a punchline all these years later, even after legalization in Boulder, Colorado, of all places. And that's okay, let's lean into it for a second. Real quick, what do you call a stoner with two spliffs? Double jointed, yes. Terrible joke, I know, but the truth of the matter is marijuana can save lives. And I know this to be true because I read it in the New York Times. More importantly, I know it to be true because I've seen it with my own eyes, time and time and time again. That said, if I'm you wondering who this guy is up here talking to you about marijuana saving lives and potentially helping us curb the opioid epidemic at hand, I'm wondering two questions. First, what are you smoking? And two, who are you? So to answer that first question, nothing at the moment. Second question, hi, I'm Ricardo Baca. I'm a Colorado native, 41 years old. I live in Denver with my wife, 2 dogs, and a cat. 30 years ago, I was sitting in the front row of a classroom in a suburb not far from here. My green t-shirt says, "Just say no." The teacher at the front of the class, she's telling us that marijuana can kill us. I have a couple friends. They're going to a drug-free camp for the weekend. I ask my mom, she's cool with it. We walk through the doors under a banner that reads, "Hugs, not drugs." Sure, sounds like a good time. Lots of hugs, also lots of drugs. Fast forward all these years now, and I'm a journalist, and I unintentionally made international headlines a few years ago when my editors at the Denver Post appointed me as the newspaper's first ever cannabis editor. And I promise you, it's true. You may have read about it in the New York Times, or you may have seen me on the Colbert Report for that matter, but let me tell you, when I first got this job, I had a first imperative that I held myself to, and I knew that I needed to seek out the most respected voices on each side of the legalization debate. And so I went and hung out and got to know the prohibitionists. And I went out and got to know the people who were just legalizing marijuana in Colorado. And I will always remember those conversations because they were incredibly formative and educational. And one of them still sticks out to this day. A guy named Mason Tvert. He and I set up a meeting, and many of you probably know the name. He was instrumental for legalizing cannabis in Colorado. And if you Google Mason's name, you will see that there is a quote that I bet he has told to 250, 300 journalists at least. And that is, marijuana is safer than alcohol. It went contrary to what I was taught with the whole marijuana will kill you part. And so I knew that I had some homework to do before I met Mason. And so before this meeting, I set aside 3-4 hours for research, and I sat down on my computer ready to do the work. And 5 minutes later, I had everything I knew I needed. And that is, I had the information that told me from trusted resources that cannabis is indeed way less toxic than alcohol. In fact, last year, we lost nearly 80,000 Americans to alcohol-related causes. In that same time, we lost 0 to cannabis. Cannabis is non-toxic. CTRL-ALT-DEL. Yes, I was lied to my entire life. In fact, I would argue that most of the people in this room were lied to our entire lives. And yet, here we are talking about it, and I'd like to have some real talk on the subject of cannabis as medicine, but also more related to this talk, and especially since this is bleeding edge information that I personally find a lot more interesting, cannabis as a painkiller. So as we've been discussing, we are in pain. Pain affects more Americans than heart disease, diabetes, and cancer combined. We need to kill this pain. I was speaking with a dear friend of mine recently, and she was telling me about the debilitating pain she lives with day to day to day. Sometimes it keeps her up for 3 or 4 days on end. I didn't even know that kind of pain existed. And then when I was doing research for this talk, I learned this quote from a 1930s French physician: "Pain is a more terrible lord for mankind than death itself." But the painkillers are killing us. And this is brand new data from the CDC. 49,000 Americans died last year from opioids, from prescription opioids. That's more than the AIDS crisis at its peak. And how long did we ignore that? And how long are we going to ignore this opioids epidemic, especially when we now know and are learning that there is a safer alternative painkiller out there? Yes, I am talking about marijuana, but no, I'm not saying that cannabis is a cure-all, because it's absolutely not. But it is our responsibility to pay attention to the vanguard of science and medicine, because increasingly these physicians and researchers are telling us that cannabis is medicine, and indeed, cannabis is an effective painkiller. A landmark study came out last year from the National Association of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, telling us that cannabis and cannabinoids are effective treatments to chronic pain in adults. And that is huge. It's huge. And when put in concert with other research that's been done in the last 3 or 4 years at universities ranging from Columbia in New York to the University of Georgia in Athens, we now know that cannabis legalization is changing our relationship with the opioid crisis ever so slowly. This research is telling us that fewer opioids are being prescribed in states that have legal marijuana programs, that fewer people are going into emergency rooms with opioid-based conditions, and most importantly, fewer people are dying in these states from opioids, and that is because these states have access to legal marijuana and they have liberalized their cannabis laws. And so what we're seeing is the gateway drug suddenly becomes an exit drug for something far more serious, something far more deadly, which oddly reminds me of another weed joke. Do you ever hear the one about the big, bad, scary drug we were taught to fear, that we were told would kill us, and then later emerged as this potential life-saving option to save tens of thousands of lives after we've needlessly lost hundreds of thousands of others? Thank you very much.